Welcome to notebook number 2, selecting subsets of data from data frames with the loc indexer. So we're going to learn a different type of subset selection. This loc indexer has different rules than the square brackets. So you have to forget about the square brackets for a moment and think of this as a new tool that has its own rules for subset selection. There will be square brackets appended to it always, but they have their own rules and it's distinct from these square brackets that are immediately appended to the data frame. So your syntax when using loc is going to look something like this. The loc indexer is able to simultaneously select rows and columns, so which the square brackets itself is not able to do. Okay, so let's take a look at the generic syntax. It's going to look like this: df.loc square brackets. Then you have the row selection, comma is very important, the column selection. So rows and cols will just be variables that you define. You can also just put your selection right there without putting any variables whatsoever. But this is your generic syntax. This is very important to understand what it is going to look like. Okay, so the loc indexer primarily selects by label. That's the other big component here. And we'll learn about iloc, which primarily selects by integer location. So the loc indexer also can select by Boolean selection, but we're going to learn about that in a later chapter. Right now we're going to focus on how it selects by label. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Read in our data frame. We're going to put, again, this is important here, we're putting the first column into the index. The reason we're doing that is that we have a little bit more of an interesting index and it turns them into labels. Okay, so in order to, let's complete this task, select 2 rows and 3 columns with loc. So you can do this in one line of code, but when I first start teaching this, I really like to separate out the row selection and the column selection. So for rows, we'll just pick 2 of these rows and we can put them in a different order. So say Dean and Nico. And for calls, it says let's do 3 columns. So we can do state, food, and score like that. So when we're doing multiple rows and columns, we need to use a list. That's one of the rules here. You can use a single value. We'll talk about that in a second. But when we're doing multiple, we need a list. So we create 2 lists. We do df.loc, append the square brackets to loc, and then we just pass in rows, comma, calls. So rows is just this 2-item list. Calls is this 3-item list. We execute that, and we get our selection. So we go from this larger data frame down to just 2 rows and 3 columns. This is a new data frame. And before I forget, whenever you make a selection like this, this creates a new data frame. It does not change the original data frame. So the original data frame is still df. This creates a copy that you would have to assign a new variable to in order to reference it later. So if you wanted to reference this later, you have to do some sort of assignment statement, and then you would have it stored in memory safely. So df is still going to be df after a selection. All right, let's keep moving on. Now that you've seen a single selection, I want to talk about all the possible types of row and column selections. So what I'm specifically talking about is what are the possibilities that rows and calls can be. So here they are both lists. Now there are other combinations that it can be, but that was just one combination, is that each one can be a list. So that's right here. But they can also be a single label, such as a single string. So if you're selecting just one row, you can just put that string, or one column, you can use that string. We just saw the list of labels. You can also use a slice of labels. We'll see that in another video. Or you can use a Boolean series. This will be covered in a later chapter. Okay, so let's go ahead and make another selection. Here we're going to select 2 rows and a single column. So we're going to take df, and you know what, we'll actually define the rows here. Let's pick 2 rows. Let's do Jane and Dean. And for the columns, we'll select a single column here. And we won't use a list for this. We'll use a single label. That's what I mean right here, is a single label. Here it is a string. So we'll just use loc again because we're selecting by label. Put the square brackets there, put in the row selection and the column selection like this, and then make our selection. So here, notice it has correctly selected 2 rows with a single column, the height column. And notice that this has returned a series. It has not returned a data frame because we have a single dimension of data selected for the columns. So that is important to know. If you put square brackets around here, it will select it as a 1 column data frame. So that is a difference. Now, you don't have to create separate variables each time. I do this just for clarity when teaching. When you feel a little bit more comfortable, you can just place them all in the same indexer here. So instead of just writing out rows in a separate variable, we can say Jane and Dean. That's going to be the row selection. So that goes in the first slot. We do comma, and then we'll do height like this. As you can see, it might be a little bit confusing when you first see this, but this really is just in that rows position. Rows always comes first, and then calls comes second. Here is just a string like that. So that'll make the exact same selection. So that gets us started selecting with the loc indexer.